Welcome back to NHK New, where we decode the world's most significant shifts. Today, we're looking at a transformation that was once deemed impossible. A few decades ago, Vietnam was one of the poorest nations on Earth, struggling with stagnation and food shortages. Fast forward to 2026, and the story has completely flipped. From the Doi Moi reforms to becoming the ultimate destination for the China Plus One strategy, Vietnam is no longer just catching up, it's leading. With a growth target of 10% this year and a workforce outperforming the West in education, Vietnam is on the verge of overtaking major regional powers. In this deep dive, we explore the mechanics behind this economic miracle, the trade deals, the human capital, and the political stability driving this insane economic boom. In 1975, when the Vietnam War finally came to an end, the country that emerged from decades of conflict was not a rising Asian tiger. It was one of the poorest nations on Earth. Infrastructure was shattered, farmland was damaged, industry was almost non-existent. GDP per capita stood at just $84 a year, a figure that reflected not only economic collapse, but deep structural isolation from the global system. For many observers at the time, Vietnam's future looked predetermined: prolonged poverty under a rigid, centrally planned economy. Like several post-war socialist states, Vietnam initially adopted a Soviet-style command system. The state controlled production, prices, and distribution. Private enterprise was heavily restricted. Agricultural collectivization limited productivity. Inflation spiraled. Shortages became normal. By the early 1980s, the economy was stagnating, and living standards remained painfully low. But history rarely moves in straight lines. And Vietnam's transformation did not begin with sudden wealth or foreign investment. It began with a quiet but radical decision: to change course. In 1986, the Communist Party of Vietnam launched what would become the most important economic reform in the country's modern history: Doi Moi, meaning renovation. This was not a political revolution. The party remained in power. Instead, it was an economic recalibration. Central planning would give way to a socialist-oriented market economy. Private businesses would be allowed. Farmers could sell surplus crops on the market. Foreign investment would no longer be treated as a threat, but as an opportunity. This shift required something more valuable than capital. It required pragmatism. Vietnamese policymakers studied China's earlier reforms and adapted them carefully to domestic conditions. They did not attempt overnight liberalization. Instead, they sequenced reforms step by step, stabilizing inflation, restructuring state-owned enterprises, modernizing agriculture, and gradually opening to global trade. The results were not immediate miracles, but they were steady. Agricultural output surged once farmers were given incentives to produce more. Vietnam, once dependent on food aid, became one of the world's largest rice exporters. Small private businesses began to appear in cities. Foreign investors, initially cautious, started to test the waters. Since 1990, Vietnam has recorded some of the fastest sustained economic growth in the world. GDP per capita has climbed from double digits to nearly $5,000 today. That number alone tells a story of transformation, but it hides something deeper. This growth was not built on natural resource windfalls. It was not driven by oil booms or speculative finance. It was built on structural reform, disciplined policymaking, and long-term planning. Perhaps the most underestimated element of Vietnam's rise is its strategic patience. Unlike economies that liberalized too quickly and suffered instability, Vietnam maintained macroeconomic control. It encouraged private enterprise without abandoning state direction. It opened to trade while protecting social stability. In other words, it avoided the extremes that have derailed other developing economies. There is a lesson here that extends beyond Vietnam. Economic transformation is not simply about copying another country's model. It is about understanding timing, sequencing, and institutional capacity. Vietnam's leaders recognized that integration into the global economy required domestic readiness, infrastructure, legal frameworks, and human capital. Reform was not just ideological, it was operational. Today, Vietnam stands at a point few would have predicted 50 years ago. It is no longer defined by war, but by manufacturing exports. No longer synonymous with poverty, but increasingly associated with supply chains, technology assembly, and global production networks. If Part 1 was about internal reform, Part 2 is about something equally decisive: Vietnam's choice to embrace the world. Opening an economy is not simply about lowering tariffs. It is about redefining a nation's place in the global system. In the 1990s, Vietnam faced a critical strategic question: remain cautious and regionally isolated, or integrate deeply into global trade networks. The leadership chose integration, and they pursued it methodically. In 1995, Vietnam joined ASEAN. This move anchored the country firmly within Southeast Asia's economic architecture. It signaled that Vietnam was ready to cooperate, compete, and comply with regional trade standards. But ASEAN was only the beginning. In 2000, Vietnam signed a landmark bilateral trade agreement with the United States, a former wartime adversary. The symbolism was powerful, but the economic implications were even more significant. The agreement dramatically reduced trade barriers and gave Vietnamese exports access to the world's largest consumer market. Exports to the U.S. surged in the following years, transforming textiles, footwear, and later electronics into major growth engines. Then came 2007. Vietnam officially joined the World Trade Organization. WTO membership required painful adjustments, transparency reforms, legal modernization, and commitments to open markets. But it also locked Vietnam into a rules-based trading system. Investors now had greater confidence. Contracts were more predictable. Supply chains could be built with long-term expectations. Today, Vietnam is one of the most trade-dependent economies in the world. Its total trade volume exceeds its GDP. This level of openness creates vulnerability. Global slowdowns, trade wars, and supply chain disruptions can hit hard, but it also creates opportunity. By embedding itself deeply into global production networks, Vietnam ensured that its growth would be connected to global demand rather than domestic consumption alone. There is a strategic lesson here. Many developing countries attempt import substitution, protecting domestic industries behind high tariffs. Vietnam took the opposite path. It pursued export-led growth. Instead of shielding local firms indefinitely, it exposed them to competition and global standards. This forced productivity improvements and technological upgrading. But integration was not passive. Vietnam did not simply wait for foreign companies to arrive. It actively negotiated trade agreements, including participation in high-standard pacts such as the CPTPP and the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. These agreements were not easy politically. They required reforms in labor standards, intellectual property rules, and regulatory transparency. Yet Vietnam accepted these conditions because policymakers understood a crucial principle: credibility attracts capital, and capital did come. Foreign direct investment began flowing into industrial zones across the country. Manufacturing clusters formed around Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, and key port regions. Infrastructure expanded: highways, ports, industrial parks. Each new factory was not just a building, it was a node in a global supply chain. However, Vietnam's integration strategy carried calculated risks. Heavy reliance on exports means exposure to geopolitical tensions, especially between the United States and China. Yet even here, Vietnam demonstrated agility. Rather than choosing sides outright, it positioned itself as a complementary manufacturing base, open to multiple partners, diversified across markets. The broader value for listeners is this: globalization rewards preparation. Countries that invest in institutions, legal frameworks, and trade credibility are better positioned to benefit from open markets. Vietnam's success was not about low wages alone. It was about signaling reliability. In global supply chains, predictability can be more valuable than cheap labor. By embedding itself into the world economy, Vietnam ensured that its growth would not be confined by domestic limitations. It turned openness into leverage, transforming former isolation into interdependence. By the late 2000s, the global economy was entering a new phase of uncertainty. Trade tensions between the United States and China were escalating. Tariffs were rising. Supply chains that had been optimized for efficiency were suddenly exposed to geopolitical risk. For multinational corporations, a new question emerged. What happens if manufacturing is concentrated in just one country? This is where Vietnam's preparation met opportunity. The phrase China Plus One began circulating in boardrooms around the world. It did not mean abandoning China entirely. Instead, it meant diversification, adding another manufacturing base to reduce risk. Companies wanted stability, lower labor costs, and political predictability. Vietnam checked all three boxes. But here is the critical insight. Vietnam did not become an alternative overnight. It had spent decades building the foundation necessary to absorb this shift. Industrial parks were already operational. Trade agreements were already signed. Logistics infrastructure, while still developing, was functional and improving. Most importantly, the country had established a reputation for reliability. Major technology firms began relocating portions of their supply chains. Apple expanded assembly operations. Samsung deepened its manufacturing footprint. Google and Microsoft shifted hardware production lines. Vietnam was no longer exporting mainly garments and footwear. It was assembling smartphones, producing electronics components, and integrating into high-tech value chains. This shift matters because value chains determine income potential. Low-end manufacturing can generate jobs, but high-tech assembly and component production generate knowledge transfer, skill upgrading, and ecosystem development. Supporting industries begin to emerge: packaging, logistics, precision engineering, software support. Over time, this builds domestic capability. However, opportunity also brings pressure. Rapid industrial expansion strains infrastructure. Ports become congested. Electricity demand surges. Skilled labor shortages appear in certain sectors. If not managed carefully, growth can outpace institutional capacity. Vietnam's policymakers now face the challenge of moving from quantity to quality, from being a cost-effective alternative to becoming an innovation-driven economy. Another lesson for listeners is the importance of timing. Global shifts often create windows of opportunity, but only countries that are prepared can seize them. Vietnam did not cause US-China trade tensions. It did not design the geopolitical environment, but it positioned itself to benefit when global companies sought diversification. There is also a strategic balancing act at play. Vietnam maintains deep trade ties with both the United States and China. China remains a major supplier of intermediate goods for Vietnamese factories. The US is one of its largest export markets. Navigating this dual dependency requires diplomatic agility. So far, Vietnam has avoided choosing rigid alignment, instead emphasizing economic pragmatism. What makes this moment particularly significant is that Vietnam is no longer competing solely on low wages. Labor costs have risen compared to 2 decades ago. The competitive advantage now lies in ecosystem readiness, regulatory clarity, workforce capability, trade access, and political continuity. In many ways, Vietnam represents a case study in strategic patience meeting geopolitical opportunity. Decades of incremental reform created the credibility necessary to attract global manufacturing when the world needed alternatives. But manufacturing alone does not sustain long-term growth. The real engine behind durability lies deeper, in people. Factories can be built in months. Infrastructure can be financed in years. But human capital, the skills, discipline, and adaptability of a workforce, takes generations to cultivate. And this may be Vietnam's most underestimated strength. On paper, Vietnam is still a middle-income country. Yet when Vietnamese students participate in international assessments, such as the OECD's PISA rankings, their performance consistently matches, and sometimes exceeds, that of students from far wealthier nations. In mathematics, Vietnamese students have even outperformed their American counterparts. This is not an accident. It reflects decades of prioritizing basic education, literacy, and numeracy, even during periods of economic hardship. The lesson here is profound. Income level does not automatically determine educational outcomes. Policy focus does. Vietnam invested early in universal primary education and maintained strong cultural emphasis on academic achievement. Teachers, though not highly paid by global standards, are respected. Families view education as the primary path to upward mobility. This social alignment between government policy and household aspiration creates momentum that compounds over time. Demographics add another advantage. With a median age of around 33, Vietnam enjoys a relatively young workforce. A younger labor force supports manufacturing expansion, consumption growth, and tax revenue generation. But demographics are not destiny. A young population only becomes an asset when it is employable. That is where education quality becomes decisive. Another often overlooked factor is gender participation. Vietnam has one of the highest female labor force participation rates in the world, higher than many OECD countries. Women are active not only in agriculture and textiles, but increasingly in services, technology, and management. Expanding the effective workforce through gender inclusion strengthens household incomes and broadens the tax base. Economies that underutilize half their population simply grow more slowly. Equally important is political stability. For investors, predictability matters as much as profitability. Vietnam's one-party system has provided continuity in economic policy direction. While debates continue internationally about governance models, from a business perspective, consistency reduces uncertainty. Between 2003 and 2023, Vietnam's business environment improved more than that of any other country, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit. Regulatory procedures have gradually streamlined. Licensing processes have become clearer. Digital governance initiatives are expanding. However, stability alone is not sufficient for the next stage of development. As wages rise and competition intensifies, Vietnam must transition from assembly to innovation. That requires upgrading vocational training, expanding research capacity, and strengthening domestic private enterprises. The country cannot rely indefinitely on foreign firms for technological leadership. This is the inflection point many emerging economies struggle with, the so-called middle-income trap. Moving beyond it demands productivity gains driven by innovation rather than labor cost advantages. Vietnam's education system provides a foundation, but higher education reform, intellectual property protection, and startup ecosystems will determine the next phase. For listeners, the broader insight is clear. Sustainable growth rests on people. Trade agreements open doors. Factories create jobs, but education, inclusion, and institutional stability create resilience. Vietnam's rise has not been purely economic. It has been social, rooted in literacy, workforce participation, and long-term planning. Vietnam's story is no longer about catching up. It is about positioning. In 2025, the country recorded economic growth of around 8%, one of the fastest rates globally. For 2026, policymakers have set an ambitious target of 10%. These are not symbolic numbers. They signal confidence. But they also raise an important question. Can high-speed growth be sustained without creating structural imbalances? Rapid expansion brings opportunity, yet it also magnifies risk. Vietnam's economy today is deeply integrated into global trade. Exports account for a significant share of GDP. That openness fuels growth, but it also means vulnerability to global slowdowns, protectionism, or geopolitical shocks. During recent trade tensions, particularly under the Trump administration, Vietnam faced the threat of steep U.S. tariffs, as high as 46%. Through negotiation, that rate was reduced to 19%. The episode demonstrated two things: Vietnam's exposure to external policy shifts and its growing diplomatic leverage. Strategic flexibility has become one of Vietnam's core strengths. The country maintains strong economic ties with the United States, while China remains a crucial trading partner and supplier of intermediate goods. Japan, South Korea, and the European Union are also deeply invested. Rather than aligning rigidly with one bloc, Vietnam practices diversified interdependence. This reduces over-reliance on any single market. But long-term sustainability will depend less on geopolitics and more on domestic upgrading. The next phase of Vietnam's growth requires moving further up the value chain, from assembly to design, from manufacturing to innovation. That means investing in research and development, supporting local private firms, and strengthening digital infrastructure. It means developing Vietnamese brands, not just assembling products for foreign ones. Urbanization will also shape the next decade. Expanding cities like Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi must manage congestion, housing affordability, and environmental sustainability. Infrastructure must keep pace with industrial growth. Energy demand, in particular, presents a major challenge. A modern manufacturing economy cannot function without reliable power. Transitioning toward renewable energy while maintaining supply stability will be a critical balancing act. There is also the demographic horizon. Vietnam's population is still relatively young, but aging will accelerate in the coming decades. Preparing for that shift through pension reform, healthcare expansion, and productivity gains must begin early. Countries that wait often find themselves constrained later. And yet, the fundamentals remain strong. Vietnam has demonstrated disciplined policymaking, pragmatic reform, and social investment. It has shown that a country once devastated by war can reinvent itself through integration, education, and stability. It has leveraged global shifts rather than resisted them. Most importantly, it has avoided complacency. For listeners, the deeper lesson is this: economic miracles are rarely miracles. They are accumulations of choices, sometimes quiet, sometimes technical, often incremental. Vietnam's rise was not driven by a single policy or a sudden boom. It was built on sequencing reforms, investing in people, and remaining adaptable in a changing world. The coming decade will test whether Vietnam can transition from high-growth emerging market to advanced industrial economy. If it succeeds, it will not only reshape Southeast Asia's balance of power, it will offer a model of strategic modernization for other developing nations. Vietnam's rise challenges assumptions. It challenges the idea that post-war devastation defines a nation's destiny. It challenges the belief that only liberal democracies can deliver rapid growth. And it challenges developing countries to think long-term, not in election cycles, but in decades. From structural reform to global integration, from human capital investment to geopolitical balancing, Vietnam's journey shows that transformation is possible when strategy meets discipline. But the real question is no longer how Vietnam grew. The real question is what happens next? Can it escape the middle-income trap? Can it transition from assembly to innovation? Can it maintain balance in an increasingly divided global economy? These are the challenges that will define the next chapter. If you found this deep dive valuable, make sure to subscribe to NHK News for more clear, analytical breakdowns of the forces shaping our world. We don't just report the headlines, we connect the dots. Thank you for watching. See you in the next episode.